King's obsession takes the shape of a menagerie, first alive and then frozen forever in porcelain. In 1706, a Turkish handmaiden named Fatima is put in charge of a king's exotic animals. And decades later, a sculptor named Johann Kändler is handed an impossible commission: capture that same menagerie in porcelain, life size, or lose everything. I'm Carol Cram, host of the Art and Fiction podcast, and today my guest is Jillian Forsberg, author of The Porcelain Menagerie. Welcome to the Art and Fiction podcast, Jillian.
Well, thanks so much for having me on.
Well, The Porcelain Menagerie is a amazing novel. It's something I've never read anything like it. So first off, tell us the inspiration. Like, where did this come from?
Sure. Well, I'm one of those authors who finds a little research rabbit hole and just keeps digging. And this one was definitely that way. I uncovered the story of the Meissen porcelain that is really the main focus of this book and of art, of course, when I was researching my first novel, The Rhino Keeper. And I discovered that Clara, the Indian rhino who traveled 18th century Europe for 20 years with a Dutch ship captain, true story, sounds totally made up, some kind of Pixar movie, promise it's true. She went to a porcelain factory, and my brain went bull in a china shop. Like, how do you have a 5,000 pound full grown Indian rhino in a porcelain factory? And what was she doing there? The
Yeah.
answer was there was a king in the early 18th century, about 1710 or so, who started a porcelain factory because porcelain was more valuable than gold. Everybody who was anybody had porcelain. Most of it was imported. And he decided, in order to be the most unique king in Europe, he was going to have his own porcelain factory. But the factory wasn't just going to make regular dishes, they wanted to make a porcelain menagerie, life size porcelain animals. And you're shaking your head, and I'm shaking your head. If you know anything about porcelain, you know that you cannot make a life size porcelain rhino. It will explode in the kilns. You cannot make it, you can't do it. Not only would it be too heavy and cumbersome, but it would be nearly impossible for you to actually sculpt it and have it be accurate. So Clara the Rhino goes to this porcelain factory in the 1740s and they sculpt her. And she has these little tiny porcelain rhinos that are made and distributed throughout Europe to the very wealthy. And I had to do all this research on the porcelain factory itself. And I was really enamored with the thought that, first of all, they were making porcelain animals, which seems to be a very 1990s thing to do, but also the fact that the porcelain factory was in a castle that
Yeah.
was built in the 900s, and that it
Yeah.
was an incredible place where no one had ever really lived, and the kilns were in the basement, and the workers were dying under mysterious circumstances, and there were rivalries and there were thieveries going on, and it was dramatic. And I said, where is the book about this? And so there are a few books written in German about Meissen porcelain, but there was not a novel written from the perspective of Johann, who is the main porcelain sculptor in this book. And then as I was writing Johann's story, I got this little knock on the back of my mind, and I'm sure as a novelist yourself, you know how that goes. And it was a woman from the past, and her name was Fatima Karaman. Now, Fatima was the favorite mistress of the same king who demanded a porcelain menagerie. She was stolen as a child when she was 5 years old as a war prize, which was gut wrenching for me to read about. She had two of his bastard children, and strangely enough, she was the only woman who was left any money in his will. Now, there's one known portrait of Johann, there's one known portrait of Fatima. Even though they probably just brushed by each other in the courts, knowing that both of these people, who are minor characters in history, left behind such incredible pieces of art for Johann and legacy for Fatima, really drew me into this story. And I thought, I'm not going to be able to rest until I get this out of my brain. I just cannot. So, roundabout, I discovered this book because of my other book, but I'm so glad that I did, because it really opened this world of art history for me that I'd never thought to explore. You think porcelain and you
Yeah.
think Asia, you think China, but I had no idea that German porcelain was actually the finest in the world for a very long time.
I knew nothing about porcelain as well. Your novel actually is in the decorative arts section
Yes.
of art and fiction. So it was great because it's really lovely to find novels that have something to do with China and porcelain and those types of things. So tell us a little bit more about the king that's at the center of it, Augustus the Strong. He
He was
seems like
kind
a
of
lovely man.
bonkers.
Yeah,
Yeah, totally
he
lovely.
totally
Well,
was. And yet he
oh,
was real, wasn't he?
was real. He was actually the elector of Saxony, so he was not a king in Germany, he was a king in Poland. And interestingly
Right.
enough, in the early 18th century in Poland, the king was up for a vote, which seems really counterproductive for having a king. It wasn't a role where you can pass it down from generation to generation. But in order to be king, you had to be Catholic. And most German people back then were Protestant.
Yeah, they were.
So
Yeah.
Augustus made a very controversial decision. Now, keep in mind, if you look at a map of Europe, and I encourage people to get one out, look at where Dresden is in Saxony and Germany, and then look at where Poland is. And think about how long it would take you to get there via horse and carriage. This is not close kingdoms. We are not taking a neighboring kingdom. He would have had to travel very far to get to Poland, and that's what he did. He declared that he was Catholic. He converted to Catholicism against the wishes of his wife, who remained a Protestant queen who basically lived in a tower by herself with their son for the remainder of her years after he did this. The people of Saxony who were dedicated Protestants essentially made her a heroine. Like she became the Protestant spokeswoman of the time, which is directly against her husband's orders.
Yeah.
King Augustus bribes and drinks and gambles his way into becoming the elected king of Poland. Absolutely insane that he does this. Now, he's the second son. His older brother, who was supposed to be the elector of Saxony, died of some terrible disease that he inherited from his mistress. And that tended to be kind of the pattern of these boys, that Augustus and his older brother both had a lot of mistresses and they were not faithful to their wives. Augustus had one Englishman who didn't like him. So we have to take all history with a grain of salt when it's written from the perspective of someone who doesn't like the person they're writing about. One Englishman said that he had a rumored 300 bastard children.
My gosh. Wow.
We know of officially about 9 to 12. So if we know that there are officially 9 to 12, you have to think about the chambermaids and the cook's assistants and all of those women who he might have had encounters with that did have his progeny. Those are all the negative things about Augustus. It's difficult to paint him in a positive light, but here are the positive things about Augustus. The man had style. And the man had good taste in art. If you
Yeah.
go to Dresden today, you will see a city that during World War II was completely firebombed. Tens of thousands of people died. The city was razed to the ground, essentially. Before that, and now what has been rebuilt, is this legacy of 18th century Baroque architecture that is unmatched. If Dresden hadn't have been firebombed, I think it would be as popular a destination as Paris or Prague today for tourists. Now, they've rebuilt a lot of it. You can still go and see where everything was burned out during World War II. Part of Dresden feels like a 1980s communist city. It's because that's what it was. It was in the block. So inside of these Baroque buildings is Augustus's legacy. And that, Carol, is true treasure. The man had more treasure than any king in the 18th century. And you're thinking, what about the French kings? No. Go look up Augustus the Strong's Green Vault. In the Green Vault, there are tens of thousands of pieces of porcelain, nautilus shells, gold, gems, diadems. I cannot tell you how many priceless pieces of art that this man collected. He wanted the things that no one else had, and he accomplished that. So it's complicated because without him, the artists in Dresden and in Germany would not have had this legacy of building incredible architectural structures or having the goldsmiths or having the porcelain makers. But he wasn't a very nice human if you look at how he
Isn't
treated
that?
other people and how he
And
treated his
animals.
wife and child
Yeah.
and animals. Yes,
Yeah.
he was a big hunter. He believed in blood sports. And in the Porcelain Menagerie, there is a content warning for chapter 30. It
Yes.
deals with a terrible, terrible blood sport called fox tossing that was real.
I know.
I
Yeah, I
I
was
did not,
wondering.
yeah, I did not choose the worst blood sport that Augustus took place in. He liked to drive animals to the edge of a cliff, run them off the cliff, and have his hunters down below. When I was in Germany doing research for this, I asked one of the curators who was leading me around um, Augustus's chambers, and I said, "What do you think of Augustus as a person?" And he said, "Well, he's just a normal king. You have good and you have bad in every person that you meet." And I was astounded by that. It is true. But in this book, he is not painted as someone that you would want to be friends with unless you really like ambition, power, and things. So, it was kind of fun to write him, honestly. because he got to do just unhinged things. Like he's absolutely bonkers, and it's always fun to write. I'm going to use air quotations, a bad guy like that. But without him, both of the true main characters would not have had the lots in life that they did.
No, that's what was so fascinating about Augustus. I mean, he's not the central character, but as you said, nothing would have happened without him. And just this concept that you've got someone who's heinous, he's horrible, and yet he did all these great things. So, yeah, it's I love that dichotomy and exploring that as a novelist. I can imagine that must have been fun. I
It
just
was.
circle back to Dresden, and I know it was flattened.
Mhm.
So, what happened to all the porcelain and everything? I mean, how did they
Yeah,
get it back?
it's a great question, and something that I did a lot of extensive research on was
Mm.
how many pieces were destroyed of Augustus's treasures. The answer is not many, because Adolf Hitler also valued things.
Oh, okay. So
So
he
when
hid
the
them
war
away.
started, things were hidden
Yeah,
away. Now, the Meissen porcelain factory is actually in a city just north of Dresden. And it's a small town called Meissen and a castle called Albrechtsberg. Now,
right.
Albrechtsberg is no longer used as the porcelain factory. It was moved, and now it's in a proper factory instead of a 10th century castle. Can you imagine? I think about it every day. Anyway, there were about 300 pieces of the porcelain menagerie that originally existed from the 18th century. There are now about 75 pieces. The tricky thing is the molds that Johann Kändler made still exist in the factory in Meissen, and they're still in use. You can go to Meissen today and buy a six-figure, life-size goat, chicken, swan, peacock, and you can have it shipped to your home in the United States. Takes a long time. And they are using the original sculpt that Johann Kändler made. Now the molds have to be remade because they get a little fuzzy after several uses, but
Yeah.
they still use them. But the real treasured ones are the ones that he created and that were fired during his lifetime. Those are the ones that are considered the original menagerie pieces. And I've talked to many, many museum curators throughout the world who have been able to handle these. And I asked them, what would you consider the greatest porcelain masterpiece of all time? And all of them that I've talked to have collectively said it is Johann Kändler's Porcelain Menagerie. The imagery is astounding. The animals that he created have emotion in their faces. And you can see there is angst, there is love, there is gratitude, there is servitude. There are so many things when you look at these sculptures that go beyond just an animal. It is not a surprise that they are so revered and so brilliantly held in museum collections around the world. If you're near a major museum that has European art, most of them will have Meissen. A lot of them will have birds. That was one of Candler's favorite things to make because they're little.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you don't have to put much effort into a wren,
Yeah.
So you can usually go onto a website for a museum and see if they have any Meissen. If
Oh,
you're near New York City, the Metropolitan Museum of Art has a fabulous Meissen collection, including a bust of Augustus the Strong's jester, who made a joke to the king about a mouse that has now been lost to time. The joke has been. But the rumor goes that the jester was put in jail because of the joke. And so Johann Kändler made a life-size bust of the jester with a mouse dangling from his mouth.
oh.
And on his lapel is a medallion with the image of Augustus the Strong on it, which of course was presented to the king with great fanfare, and apparently Augustus loved it. So, there became this strange push and pull of what am I allowed to make and what does the king want and how can I make sure my artistry lives? The reality was the fact that they made any porcelain at all was a miracle, a
Oh.
true and utter scientific miracle.
Well, yes, because it came from China, didn't it? And
Hmm.
they didn't know how to do it, right? Because you talked a
No,
lot
they
about
didn't.
that in the novel. Yeah.
Yeah, that
And
was a really interesting thing for me to learn as well. I was a novice to porcelain making, and I actually called two of them. One of them is local to me, so I was able to see some of his work and actually, talk to him about how this process works. But the other one, her name is Trisha Zimick, and she was invited to Meissen to exhibit her porcelain monkeys. So I wanted to talk to someone who made animals and who had been to Albrechtsberg to display their work. So that was a fascinating conversation. But what they have the advantage of that you don't have in the 1700s is electricity. You don't have an electric kiln. You don't have a timer to go off. You don't know how hot the fires are. All of it is guesswork. And they also didn't have the right bed of clay until about 10 years into the process. And they found one in the mountains of Germany that is still held secret today. When I was in Albrechtsberg, I asked them, where is that bed of clay that you get all this stuff from? And they were like, we cannot tell you
No.
where that clay. No. So there's still things held in secret. But Chinese porcelain, I did a lot of research on that too. They imported a lot of it. The VOC, the Dutch East India Company, made a fortune importing it around Africa and getting it to Europe. There is a city called Jingzhedin in China that really holds the crown for the best porcelain made in ancient China and onward throughout the 17th and 18th centuries there as well, until Europe figured out how to do it. But a Jesuit went and wrote down all of the steps for porcelain, and he did so by just spying. There are 72 steps to make porcelain in China, and each one of those steps is carried out by a different person. So if you handle the clay mold, the next person that you hand it off to does something entirely different that you do not know. You know your one step, and then you pass it on. So it has to be this community effort in order to make the perfect piece of porcelain. And I love that about it. But I also love that it was held so secret for so many generations. And that was really how they built this intangible, breakable wealth. They could
Yeah.
not have survived without the community that knew the next step in the porcelain, but they also were never going to give up each other's secrets. It's fascinating how it all worked.
It is totally fascinating. I wonder if to this day is it still kept secret, each of the steps.
I would assume that there's an element of secrecy to all of it because they still make porcelain in that community. And I think tradition in porcelain making is really important. It is in
Yeah.
Meissen. They still do things a lot of the same way that they did back in the 18th century when they started. And there's, like I said, they're still in business today. So tradition and secrecy going hand in hand add this element of allure and mysticism to making these breakable objects. And think about that. You have a king who, instead of going after land or marrying off his one son to really benefit the kingdom, which is what really was going to be successful for you in order to have a great kingdom anywhere. I mean, think about what Maria Theresa did of the Habsburgs. Like, all her goal was to make sure that her children made a bigger community for her so that she could really have the best kingdom she possibly could. Augustus instead was focused on getting objects,
Yeah.
decorative art.
Yeah, it's interesting that that was his focus. And I just love the term white gold because that's all the way
Yes.
through the novel. That porcelain was white gold. I wonder why it was so prized.
I think there's always something to be said about rarity. And
Yeah,
if you have something no one else has, especially in the 18th century when you can't just Amazon something or go to the Met and see it, museums didn't even really exist back then. In order to get to Augustus's throne room, you had to walk through his collections. So it added this layer of he's the most important person you have ever seen. And I think that was the legacy of porcelain was you cannot have this unless you have it or you know how to get it. So it became this status symbol, kind of like a
yeah,
Birkin bag. You can't just go into Hermes and buy a Birkin bag. You have to have the status to do it. So that's what it became for all of these kings, to the point for Augustus, though, of true obsession, to
yeah.
the point where he valued those objects more than he did human lives. And that's where things started to get a little nasty within the factory that he put together.
Oh, no, no kidding. Yes, because there's that scene where he gives away 600 people in exchange for porcelain, which I
I
presume is
wish,
true.
I wish it were fake. He traded 600 dragoon soldiers
Yeah,
for Chinese porcelain pots,
yeah. That's
fully armed with their mounts. And there's no record, Carol, of what their families did. And I think about that all the time. They had wives and children.
of
He's just
course.
going to
Yeah,
trade them for objects. And I saw those. They're still in the museum in Dresden. They're about the size of my 10-year-old child. So they're big pieces of Chinese porcelain. But what are
yeah.
you doing? Why would you trade away your army for porcelain? It sounds made up. Every major plot point in this book that sounds made up is totally true. And that has blown people's minds. They're like, what do you mean it's true? And I'm like, yeah, how could I have made that up? I never would have even assumed that someone would be crazy enough to trade porcelain for people.
It's incredible. So the character of Johann, he's a It's a very appealing character. Because he's kind of a prisoner, but he's also an artist and he's getting to do what
Mhm.
he wants to do. So tell us a little bit more about Johann, of course, who is real, but Johann as your character.
I had an early editor call him a cinnamon roll.
Cinnamon roll. Oh, I like that. What does she mean by that?
I think she meant he's just a warm, kind a little bit spicy, but a really warm, cozy guy.
That's true. Yeah, he's a nice guy. He's such a great
He's a nice
foil
guy.
for Augustus,
Yes,
you
he
know.
is. And he stayed in real life. He was born about 1705 and died in 1775. And he stayed at the Meissen porcelain factory for his entire life. Once he was on board, he did not leave working there.
He
And
couldn't leave, could he? He couldn't leave.
when Augustus's son took over the
Oh,
kingdom and the factory, then the porcelain artists had more freedom. When Augustus himself was there, no, they really couldn't leave. There was so much fear about the porcelain formulas being stolen, and also about Johann Kändler, who's the most talented sculptor in Europe, being taken and basically kidnapped to work for another porcelain factory like Sèvres in France, that there was no way that he was ever going to really let him go. But there's also this contradiction there where you're held captive, but where could you go that you could do your art? There's no other porcelain factory in Europe that could do what he wanted to do. And so that there's so much internal agony there where you know you're basically being held captive, but you stay because that is where your heart is.
yeah.
It's so complicated, but I know a lot of artists under patronage, which he basically was under king's patronage, had to have felt the exact same way. And I don't feel like we see that controversial pull from them very often. It often feels like in fiction we see a lot of artists who, oh, he got a patron, good for him. Now he can get paid to do his art. But could he ever do his art freely? Or is he forever under the tutelage of a king who's going to tell him what to do his entire existence?
Which was the case for most artists right up until, well, Mozart.
Yep.
They were under patronage. So Johann being a prisoner there, in a way, there's a great parallel between him and the animals.
Yes.
And Fatima even talks about how would the animals be better off if they were free? Well, probably not in the context of where they were. So let's just back up a minute to Fatima. And this is a question I kept having as I was reading it. Why did she want the menagerie to begin with? Because she
I
was the
think part
one
of
that
it was,
wanted it.
yeah, she was the one who wanted the menagerie. I think part of it was control.
Okay.
She has no control over anything that's happening, even from the time of her being stolen as a child. You're stolen, you're passed around as a war prize in real life. That's really what happened. She was taught many different languages and basically became a handmaiden. And as a person of color, she was very lucky, quite honestly, that she wasn't just sold into servitude, that someone actually saw enough intelligence in her to teach her how to be a proper lady, if you want to call it that. And then one day she gets a letter out of the blue that King Augustus the Strong is going to replace his current mistress with her. She was 16. Her age is not really mentioned in the book, but I simply cannot imagine that in 9 years since you were stolen from your home, that your life ends up like that. But for me, Fatima needed to control something. And since she couldn't control anything around her, and I think there's this innate desperation for a woman to be able to love something. And because she could not love Augustus and she couldn't love any of the other people around her safely, she could put her love onto an animal. And that was pretty
Mhm.
easy for her, especially when she got her little monkey, Amar. Johann Kändler did so many monkey sculptures, and they're all holding little things. And they all have chains around their middles, and they have these beautiful colors on them. Every animal in the book is sculpted by Johann at some point. And so I made sure that all the menagerie animals were represented in their same way. And there's not a single piece of art in the book that isn't real. So those are other things to keep in mind as you're reading. But Fatima and the menagerie parallels her own life and Johann's life. One of the things I really wanted to do was show how we can care about things that are lower than us. And Fatima's the lowest of the low. She's a person of color. She's not of royal birth. She's a handmaiden. She has no status. She has no symbol. She's not important. She's the king's mistress. There's who is lower than her in the king's eyes because he has full control over her. So really it's this power struggle because Fatima's very complex as well. She's not perfect at all. She makes really poor decisions, honestly. and she makes brash decisions, and she uses her femininity to get what she wants a lot, which is also probably something that she could have not done. By
But could
having the
she?
menagerie, yeah,
Yeah.
by having the menagerie in place, she gets a little agency. And by having it manipulate what Augustus does next, which is very important for the chapter with the content warning, he shows her, sorry, sweetheart, you might think that you're in control, but you're actually not.
Yeah. I know that was such a horrendous chapter. So, what do you think when you're writing there, or now that the book is written, that the theme of the novel is?
It's such a complicated theme. I've thought about that a lot, and I think that the theme is about art in itself. And the menagerie can be considered a piece of art here too.
Hmm.
You can put your heart and soul into something that someone will love, but they may never think about the person who made it. And that goes for Augustus as well. That goes for writers too. Like, we're often just the footnote, just the last name on the top of the page. We're just on the title, and people don't think about the person who sat down and wrote all of these words or did all of this research. But the other thing that I think is really important for the Porcelain Menagerie is the agency piece, where
Yeah.
Johann controlled what he made. Fatima tried to control her surroundings by creating something that she thought was important. And even if you have an overlord telling you that these things are not important, you can often, in some sly way, manipulate yourself into making them believe that they are. And that's exactly what both Fatima and Johann did by presenting King Augustus with what they thought that he might want to see, when in reality they had more power over him than he would ever have liked to admit.
It's true because they were the creators.
Yeah,
So really the theme of creation, how you have control over your own creation, that's one thing they can't take from them. Yeah,
correct.
interesting. That is true. So I want to talk a little bit about Meissen because I've never been
Yeah,
there. I've still never been to that part of Germany. I haven't been to Dresden yet. So you went to Meissen and you saw Johann's grave. So tell us a little
I
bit
did.
about that.
Well, I really like to be immersed in my research. And so for me, there were a couple things I did for this book. The first was I had to meet a lion. I had to know how a caregiver would be approached by a lion that was familiar to it or vice versa, especially in a setting like an 18th century menagerie. And after I did that, I love getting to know the animals that I write about, and all of my books have animals in them. After I did that, I knew that there were a few things I had to wrap up. And one of them was, what does a a 10th century castle smell like?
Mm.
I need to know. So I hightailed it over to Germany. I went to Prague, and then we took a train to Dresden. And from Dresden, we took another train up to Albrechtsberg and Meissen. When we were in Meissen, we got a little Airbnb. It's a small town. I think there's fewer than 20,000 people that live there. And anytime you're not in a tourist town and you're an American in Europe, things feel very immersive. Things are not tailored to you. These are people's lives. This is not Paris by the Seine. This is real life. People are working at this porcelain factory today. People are hauling things down the river. You are on a train that people are taking from Dresden to Meissen because they live there and they work in Dresden. So it was very immersive, and we found this incredible 15th century old apartment building that we were able to rent as an Airbnb. And on the way up the spiral staircase, of course, there's this gorgeous mural of St. George and the Dragon that was
Oh my God.
preserved from, I know, and I have gorgeous photos of it. And I said, I'm in the right place. Of course, we have the very top room, and the door locks with a big skeleton key, and it's like one big room and then a bathroom, because that's how all apartments back then were. They were all studios, right? And the windows are leaded, and the view from the top of the city, we had to walk our suitcases all the way up there because there are not Ubers in Germany, despite it being a German word, just so everyone is
Yeah.
aware of that. We hauled our suitcases all the way up the cobbled streets and all the way up this staircase, and we looked down over the valley of this river, and there are birds flying, and there are perfect blue skies. There are castles in the distance. We can see Albrechtsberg, where my book is set. It is the most beautiful view. There are garden walls and cats and heavily burdened cherry trees. And I'm like, where am I?
Mm.
So we go on the tours of both the porcelain factory, where we got a behind the scenes tour and got to see some of the artists in action. We got to see the modern kilns. I got to dip my hand in the kaolin clay that was held there waiting. I know. So there was Meissen porcelain stuck under my fingernails. We painted our own porcelain mug so I could see what it was like to paint. I tell you what, Carol, I am not a talented I'm a talented artist with words. I could not paint that porcelain mug to save my life. And they sent it to me 6 weeks later. They fired it and mailed it all the way to Kansas. And I got it in the mail and I opened it up and I'm like, oh my gosh, how embarrassing is this? I
Well,
tried
you
my
had to feel
best.
it. Yeah. I mean,
Yes, I
it's
did. And
research.
I yeah, I got to know the texture of what it's like to take that special paint and put it onto an unglazed cup. And it was just an incredible experience. So we tour Albrechtsberg in the castle, we tour the porcelain factory, we're wandering around the city, we go down by the banks of the river, and I say to my husband, I wonder if Johann's grave is in Meissen or if it's in Dresden. And I'm thinking it's probably in Dresden because he was the king's favorite sculptor. And I look it up and it gives us coordinates, and I'm surprised to see that it's actually within walking distance. So we traipse our way back up to our Airbnb, and I'm like, this has got to be wrong. I probably put in the wrong thing because we're literally on the same path. I'm like, all right, let me stop. I'm going to put in the coordinates again. I'm sure I've just done this incorrectly. No, it still is taking us instead of right to our Airbnb. It wants us to go left into the churchyard that is directly across the street.
Wow. Yeah.
So we go into this churchyard. Of course, the church bells start chiming. It's a beautiful May day. And I wander around the graveyard for a little. I couldn't find his grave at all until my daughter says, Mom, there's another one that looks really old underneath that bush over there. And we go over to the edge of the graveyard, and his grave is taller than I am. It is sculpted with skulls and books and snakes and apples and all of the things that you would expect from Johann Kändler, the sculptor, to have on his grave. And I turn around, and the kitchen window from our Airbnb is pointed directly down to the bush where his grave has been. And I realized that every single time I looked out the window for the past 3 days, I was looking directly at him.
That gives you
I
chills. Yeah.
It does.
Yeah.
So the next day I went down and I read him some of the book, the part where he and his little brother have a moment together, and I read him that, and I just spent some time there, and I thought, there are no accidents. When we create art, we open portals to the past or to the future where we allow people to say hello to us. And every time I
Yeah.
go to a museum and I see his name on a placard, I'm like, hey, buddy,
Yeah.
nice to see you again. And who knew, I booked that Airbnb a year before our trip. I had no idea. I just can't help but think that it was just a little nudge from the universe that I was doing what I was supposed to be doing.
I love that idea that as novelists, yeah, we're opening this portal to the past. It is true because you create these characters, and even if they're fictional, like mine tend to be more fictional, but they interact with real people. But yeah,
Hmm.
you do feel this sort of connection went to the past when you do that, which is, I guess that's why we do it. It's one of the reasons why we do it.
Absolutely. Yep.
Now, you just said that you read to Johann's grave. Would you like to do a short reading from the Porcelain
Sure. I was
Menagerie?
debating
Yeah.
about what to read. I'm like, what am I going to read? I'm like, should I read the scandalous chapter? No. So chapter 30 is a bit dramatic. So the
It's
content warning
dreading.
basically, I want to read the content warning because I think when I was doing this with the editor, there were a couple different opinions about this. One was that I should scrap the chapter altogether.
Oh no,
I
no,
couldn't. I
no.
absolutely couldn't
You
scrap it
had to have
altogether
that.
because I had to have it. I had to show how terrible everything actually was. Like, that's literally the climax of the book. And then the second editor said, okay, so put in a content warning. And I said, I don't really want to list all of the things that happen in this book as some content warnings do, where, hey, you're going to see this, and this. I wanted to write the content warning in a way that felt purposeful and wasn't, I put this chapter in to be graphic because I didn't. I put this chapter in for a specific reason. So I'm going to read that, and then I'm going to read a little bit of Fatima, actually. So this is the book. If you're watching, this is the Porcelain
Gorgeous.
Menagerie.
Yeah.
Thank you. Reader beware. The truth of history is people come across things we'd rather close our eyes to. In this book, based on truth, is a cruel sport called fox tossing. I wish it weren't real. There's also a woman who cannot escape the reality that women are seen as objects, even today. I wish that weren't real either. If you find yourself needing to close your eyes, skip chapter 30. If you find yourself wanting to feel the fire I did when I uncovered these unfortunate realities, read it all. I feel like that says things pretty clearly.
No, it's perfect.
I was pretty mad when I found out all the things that he did. So, I'm going to read when Fatima um, gets this is chapter 16. She gets a load of animals for the menagerie. Through her window on the third story of Augustus's palace, Fatima watched a large crate on the back of a wagon rumble by, heading toward the menagerie. Sailcloth draped the load. Fatima strained to hear the voices of large, ruddy-faced sailors who led the horses. The wagon disappeared into the copse of trees that marked the menagerie's border, and Fatima darted from her chambers. On slippered toes, she took the stairs, heaving her petticoats around her ankles, catching bits of cloth on the rail. Her gown fit her beautifully, and she felt like a glowing flower, golden yellow in the gloom of the darkened hallways. Dripping pearls adorned her earlobes, and her dark hair was pulled into a low, twisted maze of braids and curls, a style that Friedrich said he liked. He made her feel wanted, fair of face. The first floor moved with the early morning preparations. Servants and noblemen paid her little mind, for their daily tasks awaited them. Soldiers stood in the courtyard, short swords drawn in practice. The soldiers were always there, though Fatima did not understand why. The king had personal guards who rarely left his side. The soldiers kept busy practicing drills, sharpening their weapons, wandering the yard after too much ale. But their primary duties came when Augustus had visitors, and they lined the halls in a show of prowess. Porcelain and soldiers and books and art and musical instruments and gilded statuettes and her. All things King Augustus used to show his immense wealth. Eyes watched Fatima as she crossed the courtyard where soldiers socialized, their conversations silenced as she walked by. She glanced their way unabashedly, and all but one turned their eyes to the ground. He stared openly, and she lifted the edge of her lips in a half smile, blossoming pride reverberating in her belly. Why flirt with this one? She had the attention of the porcelain maker and of the king. She had no reason to catch his eye, but she did not look away. It gave her some kind of power. Her path took her toward the men, into an open-air portico that melted into the yard and down to the menagerie. The soldier opened his mouth as she passed by and took a half-step toward her, then lowered his arm and stilled. She'd seen this one in the king's courtroom, advising Augustus. He was handsome. Perhaps in his late 20s, he had a dark, close-cropped beard and light eyes. His uniform clung crisply to his narrow-hipped frame, and Fatima swished her skirts, unfurling frankincense perfume his way. She heard him inhale. Mouth in a complete smile now, she raised her chin and exited the courtyard. Her rendezvous with Friedrich made her feel invincible. Catching another man's attention seemed a small, trivial thing now. A narrow outdoor hallway that connected the stables to the castle was the final structure before the menagerie. The stone floor was slippery. She kept her eyes locked from window to window, craning her neck to see the cart and cage perhaps now unveiled. She wrapped her hand around a stone column and propelled herself out of the palace to the grounds. Her cape furled in the gray morning light. Dew caught the edges, turning it deep blood red. Her hair gleamed, raven feather black, loosening from the thong that tied her braid. Her movements were sure, determined. There was no stopping Fatima, the king's lady, queen of the menagerie animals, but of nothing else. Fatima ran, joy in her legs, though they were sore, pushed to her limits by the porcelain maker. The lawn dotted her rebellious bare legs with cold dew, and her leather slippers were soon soaked through, stretching around her feet. The smell of the morning woods ahead greeted her, pine needles, animal droppings, hay. From the back of the menagerie came the shouts of men, and rustling beyond the trees that hid the black cages. She paused, looking back at the palace for a moment. The bearded soldier watched her from a stone column. She raised her red hood, knowing it showed her more clearly to him, and smirked again, disappearing from his view into the menagerie woods. It was like stepping into another world. The tree canopies overhead creaked in the wind, leaves dancing, blurring the sunlight and dropping, signaling early autumn. In the distance, she heard her exotic birds saying good morning to each other in their particular ways, croaking, cawing, and from the parrots, foreign words learned from former owners or sailors cast high in the damp air. She wished they knew what they said, though she realized it was likely the word hello in whatever language they absorbed. She paused by a large pine, its bark rough and scaling, trying to get the perfect view of the wagon with its cage. When she closed her eyes, she saw two things, Friedrich's face, and the face of the promised animal that was supposedly held in that wagon.
That's great. Yeah, that brings the whole novel back to me. That's wonderful. You're very good with your description.
Thank you. It's one of the things I love the most about writing about animals in art and in the
Yeah.
past.
I can tell.
Oh, yeah, you can fully immerse yourself in a
Yeah.
world for a while that feels I actually had a couple of reviewers say that this reads more like a fantasy novel, and I said, "Well, technically isn't all historical fiction fantasy because we don't
Yeah.
know what it was really like then anyway, so you have to world build, you know?" But thank you for that compliment, I love to hear that.
Thanks. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit about your research because so much of your materials would have been in German and Old
Yeah.
German. And I remember from researching one of my own novels, it's almost impossible to read. How did you deal with that? How did you manage to?
I had a few wonderful resources in the Dresden Museum and in Albrechtsberg and in Meissen who had translated things. There's a few things that were translated back in the early 1900s when they were doing a lot of history of Germany, which was great for me. But like the map that I got of Albrechtsberg, for example, was in full German, and a map of a 10th century castle that's been turned into a porcelain factory that has tiny little handwritten old German words on it to tell you what things are. I was meticulous with writing down all of the words, kind of in order of how the map was set up, and then being able to translate the words. And some of them didn't have translations, and I had to kind of figure out what it meant. But I got really lucky. There was a man who, his name is Tim, who came out with a book about Augustus the Strong. I think a month before my book was due to the editor. And I said, "Oh no, a new book in English about Augustus the Strong is super rare." I think the title of it is Augustus the Strong, Political Fiasco. Which I said,
Wow.
"Okay, perfect. Just from the title, we know we've got him characterized
Yeah.
correctly." But I was able to get in contact with that author, and he got me an early copy. So for me to just be able to kind of cross reference everything that I had done was really important. But I hate to say this in this way, but a lot of historians prior to World War II in that the German Reich era did a lot of work on researching the early kings in Germany, and a lot of that research was actually translated into English. So it wasn't as difficult as I imagined. But the other thing that I did was contacted curators who knew a lot about porcelain. They were able to really help me with how the process would have worked in the 18th century, and none of that was written down in a way that we can really access today. There's one resource. There's another porcelain maker in this book named Friedrich Bacher. He had a book that he wrote a whole bunch of things down in. The book does make an appearance in this. That book, it would, Carol, I don't know if you write things in notebooks. I do. And some of it's like a grocery list, and some of it's a little scene from a future novel, and some of it is just hodgepodge. That's what this guy's book looked like for porcelain making. And it's like, even if you wanted to fully translate it and use it, you would not be able to. There's just no, like, this is an artist's book. So I really relied a lot on already translated material. Sadly, there's a book called Augustus the Strong and His Women that's out of print, very hard to find. I was able to get my hands on a few excerpts from it that dealt directly with Fatima, but a lot of the things were not available from more of a contemporary time period with him. And I think it's just because of the destruction of a lot of things that happened in Germany over the last 300 years.
Which is such a drag. But that's
Yeah.
amazing. I'm in awe of just how hard you work to find all of
Thank
that
you.
stuff. And so one of the goals with the Art and Fiction podcast is to inspire other authors. So what's one thing you learned from writing this book that you didn't know before?
How to write middling characters. Johann, like I said, he's a cinnamon roll. He's such a sweet guy. He's really nice. Fatima, you even heard in the little snippet that I wrote, she makes bad choices. I really like her, but she should
Mhm.
not have been flirting with that soldier.
Oh, she shouldn't.
No, she shouldn't. And she knows better, and she knows that. And also Augustus, toward the end of the book, Augustus does something. You can take this perspective however you want, to or for Fatima, to
Hmm.
put her into a different position in life.
Hmm.
Augustus made a choice that actually, I believe, benefited Fatima in the long run. I'm not going to spoil what that choice is. You know what it is.
Yeah.
It's different for me as a kid growing up with 90s Disney movies. You know, you're looking at Jafar and Scar, you know, to write a villain who can actually have a positive impact on one of your favorite characters was really new for me. But if you go back to the art piece, I found myself entangling both of these timelines because one is Fatima when she's younger and one is Johann when he's about her age again, entangling them with objects
Yeah.
that I in turn became obsessed with. And now I don't think I will ever write another book without the entanglement of historical objects. I love them.
Oh, well, which leads me to my next question. What are you working on now? What's the
I
next
have
one?
written two books since then.
Oh
I'm
my goodness.
insane.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, good for you.
Yeah, and I have another one. I actually just popped open that document yesterday that has been swirling around in my brain for several years, and I might dive into that one. I'm actually currently under contract for a nonfiction book. I own a bridal store here in Wichita, Kansas, and I've worked in the bridal industry for about 20 years. And I'm doing a bridal memoir, kind of like a bridal tell-all. It's called The Heirloom Finder. My journey originally started in museums, and it goes from why on earth I would give up that dream of being a museum curator to work in the bridal industry and what my brides have endured and been through. So that book is supposed to be coming out in early 2028 from
Oh,
Plain Spoken Books, which is an imprint of the University of Kansas Press. And for my fiction, I have two manuscripts that are currently on submission. One of them is actually an ancient retelling of Daniel in the Lion's Den from the female lion keeper's perspective. It
ah,
is very dramatic because if you have an 80-year-old man thrown into a den of lions and you're in charge of taking care of those lions, you might be kind of mad. And then my next one, I go back to my home. My master's thesis was focused on the 18th century, and that's what both of my published novels are set in. So I wrote another 18th century focused novel. It's the story of a young woman in the French Revolution who is thrown into an insane asylum for women called Salpêtrière. I actually just got back from France after being there for some research. She has, you can call it insanity or you can call it a little bit of a magical touch. She has the ability to touch people's clothing and jump into their memories. And Marie Antoinette's clothing is donated to Salpêtrière after her execution. And some really strange things happen to her when she encounters the dead queen's clothing.
based on fact, or is she fictional?
She
Oh,
is based on fiction, but the donation of Marie Antoinette's clothing to the insane asylum is true.
they were pretty grim, those insane. I have a scene set in a sane asylum in the 1830s, and yeah, pretty grim stuff for sure.
Yeah,
But
fascinatingly enough, that place is still in operation. It's the largest hospital in Paris. And so I was able to take a tour with one of their historians earlier this summer. And let's just say I'm glad to be alive when we're alive right now.
yes, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Jillian, for talking with us about the Porcelain Menagerie. I've learned so much more, and it's really brought your novel to life.
Thank you. It was a joy to be here. I highly encourage everyone to go check out the Porcelain Menagerie online. You can see all of the animals themselves. That's all you have to Google and then just click on images and you'll be like, how on earth did they make these 300 years ago? And if you can go to a museum and see one in real life, I know you're going to be really inspired.